we will try to discuss a few important aspects of Yajurveda. It's a very vast subject. People spend their whole lifetime, decades, to study, memorize, to contemplate on these Vedic mantras. So we will have to do justice within less than an hour. So now we'll come to the subject. As I mentioned earlier on many occasions, there are four Vedas: Rig Veda, Yajurveda, Samaveda, and Atharva Veda. In ancient times, in a normal Vedic ritual, in which the representatives of each of these four Vedic traditions are present, many of these mantras will be recited, and many of the mantras chosen to recite in these Vedic rituals are from Yajurveda. So the word Yaj itself means to perform, to worship, to perform this Vedic ritual. Yaju itself means a mantra that is used for performing these rituals. Now, there will be a representative of each of these four Vedas. The priest who represents Yajurveda is called Adharyu, and the priest who represents Rigveda is called Hota, and the priest who represents Samaveda is called Udgata. Udgata itself means somebody who sings. Samaveda is considered to be the most musical. It is sometimes called the genesis of musical tradition of humanity, because there are elaborate rules and regulations and conventions that were laid down in books and were transmitted from generations to generations of students and teachers, and practiced and preserved by scholars. And it is believed that the Samaveda is the first human endeavor to do something like singing, any kind of musical endeavor, as its origin in Samaveda. A Rig mantra which is tuned according to Swara Mandala constitutes different aspects of music, is called Saman. So Udgada is the one who sings these mantras from Samaveda, and Atharvaveda is represented by a priest called Brahma. So these are the four priests: Hota, Adharyu, Udgata, and Brahma, respectively representing Rigveda, Yajurveda, Samaveda, and Atharvaveda. Now, why did they perform these rituals? Now, something very interesting. As a student of sociology, I had to study a little bit during my academic career long back about the ancient rituals practiced by people in ancient Egypt, Assyria, in Babylon, and even in the later civilizations like the Mayan, Incan, Aztec civilizations. No? Something very interesting about the Yajurveda is these rituals were practiced, were offerings given to different deities with a prayer, so that the humanity and nature remain peaceful and happy and in perfect harmony, and the ritualist would be blessed to reach his final spiritual goal. There were four fundamental goals in Vedic scheme of life. It is called Chadurvidha Purusharthas, means four supreme goals, destinations. Dharma is the foundational, the regulatory value, the regulatory principle, goal. Mean ethics and morality that we have to practice in our endeavor, in our pursuit of worldly needs and worldly requirements, which are represented by Artha and Kama. And the final goal is spiritual emancipation, moksha, by which they meant getting out of this rotating wheel of this cosmic cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth. I mean, eventually they call moksha, dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. Now, many of these rituals were practiced for two fundamental goals. One, to attain moksha, spiritual liberation, spiritual emancipation, by which they meant realizing the unity and the spiritual oneness of existence in creation. That is one goal. Second goal was, it's called Ishtaprapti and Anishta Parihara. It's a Sanskrit term, which, because it's almost like, like a slogan. It's easy to remember if you memorize the Sanskrit technical vocabulary. That's why I remember. So Ishtaprapti means what you want to attain in secular life. The ancient sages, or not sages necessarily, these rituals were practiced by householders in their own home settings. Householders who wanted wealth, long life, progeny, reputation. They prayed for these rewards to different deities. So they propitiated different deities. It's called Ishtaprapti, means obtaining what they want. And if there is a problem in their life, to get rid of that problem. That is called Anishta Parihara. So these were the twin goals from a materialistic standpoint with which they performed these rituals. So Yajurveda explains the method of performing rituals in detail. And also it provides an insight into the world, the social background of those times. So that is a very interesting subject. I will come to that later. But before entering that subject, I want to give a few important details of the structure of this Yajurveda. So those of you who try to understand Yajurveda, you find out there are two schools, two main streams of versions, so to speak, of Yajurveda. So one is called Shukla Yajurveda, the other is called Krishna Yajurveda. Sometimes in English, they use the word the black Yajurveda and the white Yajurveda. Like Krishnam literally means, in language, it means black. What it means in Sanskrit, in Vedic language, it means a bit disorganized. In that sense, it's called Krishna Yajurveda. Then there is another version of Yajurveda, it's called Shukla Yajurveda, which is much better organized. Now, how this Yajurveda came to be divided into two traditions, that's what we are going to discuss now. So there is a legend, there's a story behind this. Now, the story itself is not very profound or significant, but the story provides you an insight into the social and cultural landscape of the Vedic times. That is the reason why these stories are important. And many modern Western Indologists who studied Vedas not the way a traditional Sanskrit Pandit in India studied for thousands of years, but from a purely academic standpoint, out of their curiosity to know this ancient heritage of the Aryan race, especially this inquiry began in the early decades of 18th century and continued vigorously throughout 19th century, right up to the middle of 20th century. And now it's going on, of course, at a different level. So these stories are very important. The story goes like this. Originally, the Vedas were just one Veda. And Vyasa was a great sage, the great philosopher saint of ancient times, who had studied entire Vedas, and uh, he thought that it'd be difficult for people to memorize and preserve these ancient Vedas if it's not classified into smaller sections. So he edited and classified ancient Veda into 4 groups. So that's how the 4 Vedas, Rigveda, Yajurveda, Samaveda, and Atharvaveda came into existence. And he taught Rigveda to one of his disciples, Hoda. That disciple, his name was Paila. So Paila was the sage to whom Vyasa taught Rigveda. So Paila was his senior most disciple. So the most voluminous part of Vedas were taught to Paila. Another disciple was Vaishambhayana. Yajurveda was taught to Vaishambhayana. And Samaveda was taught to Jaimini, and Atharvaveda was taught to Paila. This is the story. So, sorry, the Atharvaveda was taught to Sumantu. So, sometimes, please remember. Rigveda was taught to Paila, Yajurveda was taught to Vaishambhayana, Samaveda was taught to Jaimini, and the 4th Atharvaveda was taught to Sumantu. So this is the guy. So these are 4 disciples of Vyasa: Paila, Vaishambhayana, Jaimini, and Sumantu. So of these, Vaishambhayana received instruction on Yajurveda. Now Vaishambhayana had many disciples. How Yajurveda came to be divided into 2 main schools, that's what I'm going to explain. And his most prominent and brilliant disciple was Yajnavalkya, who is perhaps the most prominent philosophical figure in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. He is one of the most well-known philosopher saints known to Upanishadic times. I mean, any student of Upanishads will be impressed by this great sage. It's called Yajnavalkya. Yajnavalkya was the most brilliant student of Vaishambhayana, who was the original exponent of Yajurveda and who got instruction from Vyasa himself. Now, once it so happened that Vaishambhayana was invited for a big Vedic conference, and he agreed to go, but for some reason he could not make it, for some obstacles, and he could not inform these the scholars that he was not coming. So practically it was not his fault, but it was certainly something. It was something that should have been avoided. So he committed a papa. Papa means sin. So it was like committing a big sin if you are instructed, if you are invited for a Vedic conference and you agree to go and then you cannot go and you could not even inform them. So it's a breach of word, breach of promise. So it was considered to be a sinful thing to do that. So it's called Brahma Hatya Papa. Brahma here means the Brahmin sages were the ones who invited him, and he promised and he could not keep his promise, so it amounted to insulting them. So it was a sinful thing. Now that's the story. It only shows certain things. So it gives us insight into the cultural background of those times. And the sanctity, the sacredness, the great adoration with which the society looked upon the exponents and students and teachers of the Vedas, So that's what it shows. That's all. So it's it's a very important window into the social landscape of ancient Vedic times. So, in order to do penance for this sinful error, not going to a Vedic conference to which he was invited after making a promise to go. So, in order to get out of this out of these consequences of this sinful act, he asked his disciples to perform a ritual, and which involved a lot of vows and rituals and meditations and so on. When Vaishambhayana asked his disciples to do this penance, Yajnavalkya, who was the most brilliant student of his Vedic Gurukula Vedic school, came forward. Oh, why do you trouble these youngsters? I can do it myself. So a bit of an arrogance we can see. So he was, in fact, he was certainly the most brilliant among them, but he should not have felt it so strongly. He should not have articulated so openly. So what really happened was Vaishambhayana felt that this man was insulting the whole school, other students. So he told Yajnavalkya, right now you should leave this Vedic school. And not only that, you should leave whatever you have learned from me here and should not use it. So in the story you find, Vaishambhayana asked his disciple to vomit what he has studied. That's what you find in the story. What it means is, Yajnavalkya had to recite whatever he had studied from Vaishambhayana and take a promise that he won't use it in future. So he had to leave the Vedic hermitage. So whatever Yajnavalkya had already repeated, what he already learned, had to be left behind, and that was taken up by other students, and it came to be known as Krishna Yajurveda. So Taittiriya Upanishad and Kathopanishad, all these two important Upanishads belong to the Krishna Yajurveda tradition. So Krishna means a bit cluttered or disorganized. That's a meaning. But you can see Kathopanishad and Taittiriya Upanishad are marvelous. But of course, it's just good Brahmanas and Aranyakas and so on. Now, what about Yajnavalkya? Yajnavalkya left the Vedic hermitage, but he was a man of some stuff. He was not willing to give up easily. So he straight away went to a forest and meditated, worshipped and meditated on Lord Surya. Surya, let's say God, the sun god, so to speak, modern English, who was the embodiment of knowledge, because light is the symbol of knowledge, is the repository of all knowledge. So Yajnavalkya meditated and appreciated, and as the sun god appeared before him as a Vaji. Vaji means horse, the form of a horse. This whole story goes. Anyway, sun god appeared to him, and the sun god Surya taught him another version of Yajurveda. And that came to be known as Vajasaneyi Samhita. It is the Shukla Yajurveda. And actually Brihadaranyaka Upanishad and Ishavasya Upanishad belong to this Shukla Yajurveda tradition, Vajasaneyi Samhita. So that's how Vedas came to be divided into two traditions, so to speak. Now, in many of the Vedic mantras, the mantras themselves, in fact, reflected this idea of harmony, oneness, and spiritual unity of creation and existence. And also a prayer to the different deities, Vedic deities, that when we pursue the path of material comforts, we should not forget the value of dharma. Our pursuit of material comfort should be keeping in mind the fundamental values of dharma. So Krishna Yajurveda has got this famous Shanti mantra, Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunatu Sahaviryam Garavavahi. It's a very common Shanti mantra that we normally utter on all occasions, auspicious occasions. It is from Krishna Yajurveda. And a highly philosophical Shanti mantra, Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachidi Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Avasishyadi. That actually belongs to Krishna, that belongs to Shukla Yajurveda. So remember, Sahanavaudu is from Krishna Yajurveda, Purnamada Purnamidam is from Shukla Yajurveda. It's called why, the Vajasneyi Samhita. Now, many of these mantras are not easy to understand. And according to Vedic scholars, Vedic interpreters, there are two types of benefits by reading or studying Vedas. One is called Drishtaphala, means the obvious benefit. What is that? That is, you understand it, you read it, and then you get the arthajnanam, the meaning of the words. That is obvious. Another one is the unseen or invisible benefit called adrishtaphala. By practicing swadhyaya. Swadhyaya has got two aspects. One is you read these Vedic mantras, understanding its full meaning and significance. That is the ideal one. But Vedic scholars tell you something very interesting. Even if you do not understand the meaning, if you listen to Vedic recitation, and if you read regularly with a sense of sanctity and sacredness, these mantras, particularly Shabda Prapancha, has got a mysterious impact, a beneficial effect on our mind. So this is called Adrishtaphala. So one is you study the Vedas, get the arthakya, meaning of the words. You study with different commentaries. I should say a few things about different commentaries, of course, in course of time. So that is one. The second one is, if a person makes it a regular practice to read every day, now how do you understand this from 21st century when you look backward? Let us say about 7,000 years back, or maybe for several thousands of years. These mantras were often studied. Of course, they studied with meaning. That is the most ideal way of learning, because without studying the meaning, if you just recite, you won't get full benefit. That point is stressed again and again by many great acharyas of Veda tradition, the Mahidhara, Uvada. They all wrote commentaries on one particular shakha of Veda mantras. So it is called Madhintina Shakha. So they say that if you don't understand the meaning, you just recite, you won't get full benefit. That's true. But there was another school who believed that Veda mantras themselves have the potency to create some effect, beneficial effect in your mind and even on nature. That's what they believe. Well, I can't say as an authority on this subject, but there were attempts made by some, most of this curiosity comes from Western intellectual tradition. In India, they all believe, they mostly the traditional scholars take it all for granted. But there were a few attempts made by Western scholars, I'm referring to this event because I'm mostly addressing Western audience. So there were great scholars and very sincere students of the Vedas who went to India, who arranged the Vedic rituals and who recorded and who studied the effect of these Vedic mantras on nature. Veda mantras, and if you recite these ancient Vedic mantras, it will have a calming, tranquilizing effect on nature itself. I don't know whether sound vibrations can have an impact on atmosphere. We don't know. Anyway, there were several attempts, very serious attempts made by modern Western thinkers. That's an entirely different subject. The point is, these mantras were studied and recited and meditated upon and contemplated upon by sincere, honest spiritual seekers with a sense of sanctity and sacredness, with a sense of reverence, total faith. So what happens, those sound symbols acquire a unique potency. Word, what a word means to us very often depends upon how we listen to the word and also how the speaker utters that word. So this is a very interesting subject. So they say that many of these Vedic mantras, if you recite or if you listen to, will have a beneficial unseen effect, adrishtavalam on the listener and the student. That's the idea behind. Now, there are different branches to each of these traditions. In Taittiriya Samhita, Maitrayini Samhita, Kataka Samhita, and Kabisthala Kataka Samhita. This is all belonging to Krishna Yajurveda. Then there is one important Vajasaneyi Samhita that belongs to Shukla Yajurveda. Now, what are the topics and how did they perform, how did they utter these mantras in their daily life? I can just give a few samples. So within a very short time, it's important for us to get a real feel of the Vedic mantras. Now, one of the practices in ancient times was, the ablutions, the certain ceremonial rituals they used to perform in the morning and evening when there's a transition from night to day and from day to night, at dusk and at dawn. So they used to utter certain mantras. So, for example, Gayatri mantra. There's an elaborate description of how you invoke Gayatri mantra, which is a very sacred sound symbol, and how it is to be done in the morning, in the evening, and how profound it is, the prayers that it involves. So like an example. So see, there is I'm just reading, maybe I can reciting, what you call it, the 35th section of Mahanarayana Upanishad, which is considered to be part of Krishna Yajurveda. So some of the mantras are found in Shukla Yajurveda also. Say, for example, Ojosi, Sahosi, Belamasi, Brajosi, Devanam, Dhamanamasi, Vishwamasi, Vishwayu, Sarvamasi, Sarvayur, Abirum, Gayatri Mavahayami, Savitri Mavahayami, Saraswati Mavahayami. So you find, I'm not reciting the traditional way, I'm rather doing it in prose. So you find 3 words are used here, the 3 expressions. The sacred mantra Gayatri is conceived to be Veda Mata, the mother of Vedas. Now, Gayatrim, Saraswatim, Chandamsi, Rishimscha, Sriyamcha, Sarvam, Ega Gayatri Avahani, Atmani Avahayami. What do you mean? They turn to the east when at the time of the dawn, and then they pray, "O Gayatri, you are the essence of strength. I invoke Gayatri into my heart. I am inviting Gayatri into my heart." Gayatri is a symbol of purity of mind, purity of speech, and purity of knowledge, purity of emotions, feelings, and so on. So you find Gayatri Mavahayami. So you find three names are used to imply Gayatri. One is Gayatri. So in the morning, that divine reality that is present everywhere, the divine energy present everywhere, is invoked as a feminine archetype, the Veda Mada, mother of Vedas. And she's reverentially, with a great sanctity and sacredness, invoked into the heart, so that the rest of my day, my speech, my thoughts, my words, all will be pure, all will be spiritually in harmony with nature. Then midday is called Savitri Mavahayami. The same Gayatri is called Savitri in midday. And then Saraswati. Saraswati is later, this Saraswati became a deity, the goddess of learning. So you can find an evolution of the Vedic anthropomorphism as they use it in Vedic methodology in the analysis of Vedic tradition. The divine anthropomorphism, the evolution, that is from Gayatri as the mother of the Vedas, the essence of the Vedas is invoked into our heart. And then that Gayatri is called Savitri during the midday ceremony. Savitri Mavahayami. Avahayami means I invoke into my heart. And Saraswati Mavahayami in the evening. Now, it's a grand example. Savitrim, Saraswatim, Chamdamsi, Rishimcha, Sriyamcha, Sarvamcha, etc. I'm not reading those Sanskrit portions. What it means is the same divine reality which is invoked in the morning into the heart and is invoked in the midday and also in the evening, so that my life, my thoughts, my words, everything will be pure and in perfect harmony with nature. Now, this is a very, very interesting mantra. Again, there is another one. In the evening, Gayatri, who is invoked, welcomed into our heart in the morning. In the evening, this Gayatri is now requested to depart, go back to your mountain abode, and later come back tomorrow morning. So the Vedic symbology and the idea that the highest spiritual reality is one transcendental principle that we should invoke into our heart, so that our heart, our emotions and feelings all will be purified and make our life happy for ourselves and make our context harmonious, conducive to the well-being of others. So you can get Uttame Shikhare Devi Bhumyam Parvada Murdhani Brahmane Bhyubhyanujnada Gachhadevi Yatha Sukham. Normally it is chanted in a much more traditional way, but I'm not doing that now. Because that's not the purpose right now. So again, there is not enough time also, another reason. So here, in the evening, this divine mother is requested to depart. So, goddess or mother, now you may go and remain in the holiest and highest mountain abode of yours, until you are invoked again tomorrow morning. Now, this gives you an idea of the sublimity of Vedic culture. That is what I had to emphasize. Maya studa varada vanjidarthadatri pavani arthat maruda iva prachodayanti andaryamiruvena praninam prerayitri dvijata suryamandala brahmalokayoga pradurbhuta vedamada, etc. Now I'm not going to that, but it means I shall explain in English. I have invoked you, O mother, mother of learning, mother of wisdom, mother of purity. I have invoked you into my heart. And now you have given me what I wanted. Now you depart and come back again tomorrow morning to keep my life peaceful and happy. This is about everyday life. Now, the same text contains certain mantras that many of our friends in the Bay Area repeat. It is called the Mrityunjaya mantra. You know, the famous mantra which many of you do. Triambagam yajamake sugandhim pushtivardhanam urvarukam vandhana murtyo mukshi yama amrutad. This is the, because I am not chanting the traditional way again because this is not the right time. So here, you know, here the spiritual seeker is praying the three-eyed Lord, who is Shiva, who is fragrant and who is increasingly nourishing his devotees. Worshipping him, we may easily slip off from death, just as the ripe cucumber easily separates itself from the binding stalk. May we never be separated from immortality. So keep us linked to immortality and liberate us from the bondage of death. So it is again a prayer for immortality. Can we ever become physically immortal? Not possible. So here, this prayer involves two ideas, there are two important prayers involved in this mantra. One is, please give us health, happy life, and save us from unnatural deaths. That's the meaning here. So Mrityum Jaya mantra. I mean Mrityum Jayati iti Mrityum Jaya. Somebody who conquers, who transcends death. So Shiva is supposed to, is a prayer addressed to Shiva, Rudra. So Shiva is supposed to be the conqueror of death. So frequently people chant this mantra before they start on a journey. In ancient times, it's a common practice. Now also you find people doing that. That's wonderful, no doubt, been good. But again, there's another prayer involved. What is the prayer? Amurdat Mam Mukshiya. Please do not separate me from Amrita. Amrita means immortality, deathlessness. So one is, please save me, please separate me from death, and also please do not separate me from immortality, from deathlessness. So prayer for health and also prayer for the highest spiritual emancipation. Now, we have to remember that the Vedic mantras, if you read, they do not so obviously explain all this. So for that, you find in the Vedic tradition, there were a number of commentators, because we cannot conclude any discussion on Yajurveda without the contribution of the great commentators who have made the meaning of these Vedic mantras clear to us. The commentators of Krishna Yajurveda, you find, see, Kaudina, Pavaswamin, Guhadeva, Bhattabhaskara, Sayana, Venkatesha, Shatrughna, Haradatta. So of them, Sayana is the most exhaustive commentary because Sayanacharya was known as the commentator for all the four Vedas. The Sayana was the one commentator who lived around 13th century in South India. He is credited with having written commentaries on all the Vedas. Now the Vedas, as I mentioned, the Shukla Yajurveda, so far we are discussing about the commentators, we are discussing the contributions of the commentators on Krishna Yajurveda, especially Sayana, Bhavaswami, Venkatesha, and so on, Haradatta and others. In the tradition of Shukla Yajurveda, we have to remember there are two versions, two recensions. That it is only a technical knowledge, but it's important to understand when we study anything about Yajurveda, especially Shukla Yajurveda, which is which is called Vajasneyi Samhita, which is associated with Yajnavalkya. So there are two recensions you find in the Shukla Yajurveda. One is Madhyandina Shakha. Shakha means a branch. And one is Kanva Shakha. So Sayana again wrote a commentary on this Kanva Shakha. Ananda Bodha, Anandacharya, Murari Mishra, these are great names in the among the Vedic commentators who wrote commentaries on Kanva Shakha. Madhyandina Shakha, you find Shaunaka, Hariswami, Uvada, Mahidhara. Uvada was a very ancient commentator who lived in Kashmir and who came to Jain, wrote an exhaustive commentary on the Madhyandina Shakha. And also Mahidhara, who lived in Benares, in Kashi, who wrote commentaries on the Madhyandina Shakha of Shukla Yajurveda. As I mentioned earlier, we have these four important Upanishads, which are four of the important Upanishads expounded by Shankaracharya. Brihadaranyaka and Ishavasya Upanishad belong to Shukla Yajurveda. Kathopanishad and Taittiriya Upanishad belongs to Krishna Yajurveda. These Vedic mantras are still studied and taught and used in different rituals, especially the one which I recited, referred to just now, Mahanarayana Upanishad. It contains many mantras, of course, some of these mantras are found in other Upanishads and Vedas also, but the important point to remember is the sanctity and sacredness with which the great Vedic scholars, they preserve this tradition with total faith, what you call Siddha, that they made a unique contribution. Great Vedantics like Swami Vivekananda in modern times have commented upon their self-sacrificing, their ascetic life, which enabled them to preserve in an unbroken succession this lineage of spiritual wisdom. And again, the uniqueness of this Vedic wisdom is it is so universal. You don't read about worshipping one deity to the exclusion of all other deities. You don't hear about anything narrow, anything fanatical. Everything is so universal, and everything is linked to nature. I mean, one should live in close harmony with the world in which he is or she is living, in close harmony with all other living beings, not only human beings. And then one will be able to enjoy peace and harmony in his own heart. That's why in the morning they used to invoke the Gayatri, and the midday they used to invoke Savitri. The same divine principle is invoked in the evening as Saraswati. Thank you, Namaskar. Now we can discuss. You are most welcome to put questions according to the needs. Thank you, Namaskar.
Namaskar, Swamiji. Hari Om. Swamiji, I wanted to know why did why did four Vedas come about? What was it that distinguished the other Vedas from the earliest Veda? What were there philosophical differences in the Vedas, or were there more? Was it just a question of when they came about? Why did Yajurveda have to come separate from Rigveda? What was not there in the Rigveda that was there in the
Yeah,
Yajurveda?
according to traditional belief and some rational interpretation by modern scholars, uh, one great sage called Vyasa may have divided the Vedas into four groups and uh, taught four of his disciples, each section to each one of the four disciples. Paila studied Rigveda, Vaishambhayana studied Yajurveda, Jaimini studied Samaveda, and Sumantu studied Atharva Veda. And later on, from these four disciples, another different lineages of students and teachers emerged. And you mentioned philosophy. I want to mention something very interesting. I have mentioned a number of commentators now, like for example, Sayana, Bhattavaskara, and many others who wrote commentaries on Kanmashaka, and in Uvada and Mahidara and other wrote Mathindinashaka. Now, something very interesting is, in none of these commentaries, you come across anything like a sublime philosophical system. That was the contribution of Shankaracharya. The mantras that were interpreted as part of a ritualistic way of life, kind of ritualistic philosophy, so to speak, with great reverence and sanctity, mostly by Mimamsakas. Those mantras were interpreted as the repository of the highest spiritual philosophy by Shankaracharya. I mentioned this earlier. It may not be an exaggeration to say that it was Shankaracharya who gave me philosophical dimension to Vedic mantras. There was a high philosophy, no doubt. Many of the mantras uh, charged with high flights of philosophical thoughts. But then, as a compact metaphysical philosophical system, its own epistemology, what is called Pramana Shastras, and its own hermeneutics, principles of interpretation, and antecedent definitions. All these were the contributions of Shankaracharya. And many of the mantras in the Upanishads appear in fragments in the Samhita, in the ritualistic portions. But Shankara took them out and gave it a philosophical dimension. So that's an important point. See, Mimamsa, a ritualistic philosophy, is also one of the six systems of philosophy. But there is not high metaphysics in it. So they believed if you study, you have got this meaning. And if you understand the meaning, then if you perform these rituals, you can propitiate different deities. Then you can have wonderful things in life. Mimamsakas were very well known, very ascetic, very Spartan, and very rigid in their practice of morality, ethics, all that. But with all that, they believe that the whole purpose, the highest purpose of Vedic rituals was go to heaven. That was the idea. They did not have an idea of a transcendental spiritual emancipation, like moksha. That was the unique contribution of Shankaracharya.
Thanks, Swamiji.
Hi, Swamiji. This is Mark. Pranams, Maharaj.
Yeah.
Um, we've been studying the Bhagavad Gita on Friday nights, and I know that the Bhagavad Gita is not part of the Vedas, but would it be helpful to be able to recite the Bhagavad Gita as well as study it?
Yeah, certainly. Really speaking, if you just recite these sacred sounds, they will have an effect. It's a fact of everyday experience for every thinking person that a word, a spoken word, or a recited word, or word you read, you create certain vibrations, certain repercussions, pleasant, beneficial repercussions in our mind. And Bhagavad Gita mantras are very, very sacred. And is the Shankaracharya, who was the most uncompromising philosopher, he himself says this Gita is the essence of all the Vedas. Tadidam Gita Shastram Samasta Vedartha Sara Sangraha Bhudam Durvikiyartham. What Shankaracharya says is this Gita is the essence of the entire Vedas, of the meaning of the entire Vedas. That's what Shankaracharya says. So Gita, the Bhagavad Gita has got the status of Vedas. And the other thing is the Vedic mantras or Gita slokas, verses in the Gita, they are being recited by great spiritual seekers for thousands of years, for centuries, with a sense of sanctity and sacredness. So when we recite them or we read them with some degree of sanctity and sacredness, then what happens, that sanctity will be transmitted into our own mind. That's what happens. Again, words do contain a potency apart from their literal meaning. Literal meaning is only one fraction of the significance of a spoken word. That's a very principle upon which Vedas stand.
If you don't mind, I'd like to ask you another question.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you about a um, a chant that I'm familiar with. It's called the Gayatri or Adi Gayatri
Yeah.
that honors Savitri, the god of the sun. Could you comment on that particular chant?
Oh, yes, Om Bhur Bhuva Swa Tat Savidu, that is the Gayatri mantra that you normally chant. Now, this Gayatri mantra is chanted, uh, conceiving it, thinking of it as the embodiment of supreme wisdom in the morning and an embodiment of supreme wisdom in the evening. It is called Savitri, and the embodiment of supreme wisdom as Saraswati in the evening. And so the mantra, because they can be used without disturbing the Vedic meter, they were meditated upon. So it's not that we call upon a deity. When we use the mantras, the one who recites it conceives in his heart that idea of supreme learning, the supreme purifier in the morning, midday, and evening. Of course, in modern times, I would say Gayatri mantra itself is enough if you recite in the morning, but if one should not recite for too long, one can recite up to 10 with proper pronunciation and sense of sanctity. That is good. If a person really wants to practice Gayatri as an upasana, as a long spiritual practice, then you need to be prepared. Uh, it involves a lot of a few ritualistic purifying vows and practices which are not practical in modern times. So it is advisable not to recite for a very long time, but for a minimum number of times if you recite with a sense of sanctity and sacredness, it will have a cooling effect, a simple meaning, cooling effect for emotions and feelings. And you feel withdrawn, taken away from the disturbing, turbulent things happening around us. Because the mantras were practiced by sages in the solitude. So the mantras have acquired potency. That's a real definition of mantra. Marana trayate iti mantra. That's a definition. What means mantra is a word symbol. It's a word symbol that protects you, that preserves you, that spiritually benefits you when you meditate upon it. So that's the meaning. That's a literal translation. What it implies is a word symbol becomes more potent when you recite it and when you think, contemplate on the meaning of it. Then the word symbol assumes more spiritual benefits. So if one could recite it just a few times, not too many times, 3 times, 7 times, 10 times, then it will be certainly beneficial. Word symbols have that. Even that's true in even in Christian prayers, some of the prayers practiced by great saints for a long time. But this science of sanctity, as we find in Vedas, may not have been so scientifically expounded in books as is the case with Hinduism. In Hinduism, there are so many books written on this subject. That is interesting. Mantra Shastras, Pradishakya Samkhya. All these, there are many books written on this subject. How a mantra structured with a sense of sanctity and sacredness will have its impact on the mind of the person who utters it. That is true. If you utter a very nasty word for loudly for a long time, your mind will be disturbed, And then you play it and listen to it. Your mind will be disturbed, really speaking. Mind will become turbulent. But similarly, if you record a beautiful song, a very wonderful, a spiritually elevating word symbol, mantras we call it, or a psalm, a prayer, which is being used by saints for centuries. With that prayer, the word symbol has accumulated spiritual potency. So when we recite it with the same sacredness and sanctity and reverence, what happens, that spiritual potency is transmitted into our own heart. That's why he is, Gayatri Mavahayami. In the mantra I'm saying recited just now, in the early morning, at the time of sunrise, they used to turn to the east and looking at the sunrise, they used to utter the mantra, or divine reality, mother of learning and wisdom, please welcome to my heart and be seated in my heart and be part of my being. Avahayami means I'm invoking the presence of the divine into my heart. Now, when you utter this with a sense of sanctity and sacredness, that's very important. Then what happens, you feel a cooling effect, to use the common language. A spiritually elevating effect you feel. It's true.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So thank you for. I think next week we will discuss. Something on the Samaveda. Next order, which is actually the teacher of Samaveda tradition is Jaimini, who was himself a disciple of Vyasa. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Pranamastu.